We are not here to hold ground. We are here to destroy the enemy's ability to act. If we stop, they recover. If we hesitate, they reorganize. Speed is our protection. Movement is our advantage. We advance now. Mission parameters are set. Mission parameters are set.
George S. Patton entered the Second World War as a commander whose approach to decision-making repeatedly challenged the institutional norms of the United States Army. His most unusual and abrupt decisions were not isolated incidents of temperament, but expressions of a coherent operational philosophy that diverged sharply from prevailing doctrine. Whether this divergence reflected genuine operational insight or excessive self-confidence remains a central question in evaluating his wartime record. The U.S. Army that entered World War II was structured around centralized control, methodical advance, and strict adherence to operational boundaries. These principles reflected lessons drawn from the First World War and reinforced by interwar planning. Industrialized warfare was understood primarily as a problem of mass, coordination, and sustainability. Risk was to be reduced through careful sequencing, synchronization between arms, and deliberate tempo. Within this framework, initiative was valued, but only within clearly defined limits. Commanders were expected to preserve combat power, protect supply lines, and avoid exposure that could disrupt the broader operational design. Speed was desirable, but only when it did not threaten cohesion or control. Patton rejected this framework at a fundamental level. He believed that tempo itself was a decisive form of combat power. In his view, hesitation created vulnerabilities that no amount of material superiority could fully offset. Operational pauses were not neutral intervals for consolidation. They were opportunities for the enemy to reorganize, reinforce, and regain initiative. This belief shaped Patton's interpretation of command responsibility. Where others sought clarification or waited for formal authorization, Patton acted on inferred intent. He viewed orders as expressions of purpose rather than as restrictive boundaries. This approach reduced delay but increased risk, shifting responsibility from institutional processes to individual judgment. Here the first analytical tension emerges. Was Patton identifying a real limitation in institutional doctrine, or was he replacing collective control with personal confidence? His approach assumed that the benefits of speed consistently outweighed the dangers of overextension. Whether that assumption held under all conditions remains debatable. Patton's philosophy was also shaped by his views on morale and discipline. He believed that confidence flowed from aggression, and that aggression depended on absolute clarity of purpose. Discipline in his system was not primarily about compliance, but about psychological readiness. Soldiers who expected to move forward, he argued, were less likely to hesitate under pressure. Institutionally, this placed Patton in an ambiguous position. Senior leadership recognized his effectiveness in restoring momentum after setbacks, yet remained wary of his disregard for procedural restraint. His blunt communication style, public criticism of caution, and willingness to bypass intermediate command layers created persistent friction with higher headquarters. These tensions were not merely personal, they reflected a deeper conflict between two models of command. One prioritized control, predictability, and risk management within a large coalition force. The other emphasized speed, disruption, and the exploitation of fleeting opportunity. Patton consistently aligned himself with the latter. This raises a question that frames the entire analysis that follows. Was Patton a commander whose thinking anticipated the realities of mobile warfare, or one whose successes depended heavily on favorable conditions that masked underlying risks? The answer cannot be found in personality alone. It lies in the interaction between doctrine, institutional tolerance, and battlefield context, a relationship that defined both Patton's effectiveness and the limits placed upon him. George S. Patton regarded discipline not as a matter of ceremony or punishment, but as a functional instrument of combat effectiveness. In his view, discipline was inseparable from operational performance. It shaped how units moved, how orders were executed, and how soldiers responded under pressure. This interpretation placed him at odds with prevailing institutional norms, which treated discipline primarily as an administrative or moral concern, rather than a tactical variable. When Patton assumed command of American forces after early setbacks, particularly in North Africa in early 1943, he acted with deliberate speed. His first actions were not focused on revising plans or adjusting doctrine, but on imposing visible order. Uniform standards were enforced, command routines were tightened, and informal behavior was eliminated. These measures were intended to signal a change in expectations. Patton believed that visible discipline produced psychological readiness, and that psychological readiness enabled decisive action. From an institutional perspective, these actions were unusually severe. The U.S. Army had expanded rapidly, absorbing large numbers of inexperienced personnel and newly promoted officers. Command culture emphasized accommodation, training, and gradual professionalization. Patton rejected this incremental approach. He viewed hesitation at the institutional level as a liability in combat conditions, where clarity and certainty were essential. Patton's disciplinary measures were designed to remove ambiguity. Orders were to be executed immediately and precisely. Deviations were corrected publicly and directly. Officers were held personally responsible for the condition and behavior of their units. This approach reduced uncertainty within formations, but increased pressure on individuals, particularly junior leaders. The operational logic behind this system was straightforward. Patton believed that soldiers who were accustomed to exacting standards in routine matters would be less likely to freeze or hesitate in combat. Discipline, in this sense, was a form of conditioning. It prepared units to act reflexively under stress, reducing the cognitive burden of decision-making at critical moments. However, this approach raises a central analytical question. Did Patton's emphasis on discipline enhance long-term combat effectiveness, or did it merely produce short-term compliance at the cost of trust and adaptability? The answer is not self-evident. While units under his command often demonstrated improved performance in the immediate aftermath of his reforms, the durability of these effects varied. The controversy surrounding Patton's disciplinary philosophy became most visible during the incidents in Sicily involving soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. Patton interpreted these cases through a lens shaped by his beliefs about morale and aggression. He viewed psychological collapse as a threat not only to individual effectiveness, but to unit cohesion. His response reflected an institutional mindset that prioritized collective performance over individual accommodation. The Army's reaction to these incidents revealed the limits of Patton's autonomy. While senior leadership recognized his operational value, they also acknowledged that institutional norms were evolving. Medical understanding of combat stress was advancing, and public scrutiny of military conduct was increasing. Patton's actions, though consistent with his internal logic, conflicted with emerging standards of command responsibility. This episode illustrates the conditional nature of Patton's effectiveness. His disciplinary methods produced results in environments where authority was uncontested and objectives were clear. They became problematic when broader institutional, political, or medical considerations intervened. Discipline, as an operational tool, proved effective only within a narrow set of conditions. Patton's career demonstrates that discipline can function as a force multiplier, but also as a source of institutional friction. His methods highlight a trade-off between speed and cohesion, between immediate performance and long-term sustainability. The U.S. Army tolerated his approach when operational urgency outweighed other concerns, but imposed limits when those concerns reasserted themselves. In evaluating Patton's use of discipline, the issue is not whether it worked, but when and at what cost. His approach underscores a broader question in military history. To what extent can coercive discipline substitute for institutional maturity in rapidly mobilized forces? Patton believed it could, at least temporarily. Whether that belief was justified depends on how one weighs short-term operational gains against longer-term organizational resilience. George S. Patton approached armored warfare as an instrument of operational disruption rather than as a supporting arm within a broader, methodical scheme. His views diverged from established U.S. Army doctrine, which treated tanks primarily as tools for infantry support and exploitation following a breakthrough. Patton regarded this framework as unnecessarily restrictive and ill-suited to the conditions of mobile warfare. Interwar American doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination and phased operations. Armor was expected to work closely with infantry, artillery, and engineers, advancing within carefully managed boundaries. This approach prioritized control, cohesion, and logistical security. While it reduced exposure to risk, it also imposed limits on speed and initiative. Patton believed these limits favored the defender. Patton's alternative conception placed tempo at the center of armored employment. He argued that tanks should be used continuously, with momentum itself serving as a form of protection. Rapid movement, in his assessment, disrupted enemy command and control, prevented the establishment of coherent defensive lines, and forced opponents to react rather than plan. Armor, therefore, was not merely a tool of exploitation, but a primary means of shaping the operational environment. This philosophy became visible during the Sicilian campaign. Patton pushed armored columns forward aggressively, often advancing beyond conservative objectives and exploiting gaps as soon as they appeared. These actions produced rapid territorial gains and placed German and Italian forces under constant pressure. However, they also strained supply systems and increased the risk of isolation. The effectiveness of Patton's approach depended heavily on context. In Sicily, enemy forces were already constrained by limited mobility, contested airspace, and fragile logistics. Allied air superiority further reduced the risk of counterattack. Under these conditions, speed amplified advantage. The same approach in a more contested environment might have produced different results. Patton's insistence on independent armored action raised questions about coordination. By advancing rapidly, armored units sometimes outpaced infantry support and artillery coverage. This created vulnerabilities that had to be managed through improvisation rather than planning. Patton accepted these risks, believing that delay posed a greater danger than overextension. Here, another analytical tension emerges. Was Patton correctly identifying that modern warfare rewarded speed over cohesion? Or was he relying on situational advantages that masked structural weaknesses? His successes were undeniable, but they occurred under conditions that were not universally present across the European theater. Patton also challenged conventional views on command control within armored formations. He favored decentralized execution, granting subordinate commanders latitude to exploit opportunity without waiting for detailed instructions. This approach increased responsiveness, but depended heavily on the competence and judgment of junior leaders. Errors at lower levels could propagate rapidly through fast-moving formations. Institutionally, this method conflicted with the Army's preference for centralized coordination. While mission command was encouraged in principle, Patton pushed its application further than many of his contemporaries considered prudent. His tolerance for friction and disorder was higher, reflecting his belief that imperfect action was preferable to delayed perfection. Logistics formed the limiting factor in Patton's armored operations. Rapid advances consumed fuel, ammunition, and maintenance capacity at rates that strained supply networks. Patton acknowledged these constraints, but viewed them as problems to be solved in motion rather than reasons to pause. This approach forced logistical units to adapt quickly, often through ad hoc solutions. The reliance on improvisation introduces another evaluative question. Did Patton's approach accelerate operational success at the expense of sustainability, Or did it demonstrate a necessary flexibility in modern warfare? The answer varies by phase of the campaign and by perspective within the command structure. Patton's use of armor illustrates both the strengths and limitations of his command philosophy. When conditions favored mobility and the enemy was disorganized, his emphasis on tempo produced decisive results.
When conditions tightened, the same emphasis increased risk.
Understanding this balance is essential to assessing whether Patton's armored doctrine represented a forward-looking vision or a context-dependent solution that could not be universally applied. George S. Patton's conduct during the Sicilian campaign illustrates how his command philosophy translated into decisions that expanded and, at times, tested the boundaries of assigned authority. Operation Husky was conceived as a coalition effort with clearly delineated roles. American forces under Patton were intended to support the main British advance, secure designated objectives, and protect the flank of the Eighth Army. Within this framework, initiative was encouraged, but only insofar as it did not disrupt coalition coordination. Patton interpreted these constraints flexibly. As the campaign developed, opportunities emerged faster than the original plan anticipated. German and Italian resistance proved uneven, and gaps appeared between defensive positions. Patton viewed these gaps not as temporary anomalies to be reported upward, but as invitations to act. His advances toward key cities, including Palermo, exceeded the tempo and scope initially envisioned for his forces. From Patton's perspective, these moves represented exploitation of operational opportunity. He believed that seizing objectives quickly would shorten the campaign, reduce Allied casualties, and deny the enemy time to reorganize. Delay, in his view, would only allow German forces to establish stronger defensive lines or conduct orderly withdrawals. Speed was not merely advantageous, it was essential. Higher command viewed the situation differently. Coalition warfare required predictability, coordination, and mutual confidence between Allied commanders. Patton's rapid movements risked disrupting the synchronization between American and British forces. There were concerns that aggressive advances could create gaps, complicate logistics, or generate political friction if objectives were taken out of sequence. This divergence highlights a central tension in Patton's wartime career: the balance between initiative and control. Patton consistently prioritized the former, even when it placed him at odds with the latter. His actions in Sicily demonstrated that he was willing to accept institutional discomfort if he believed operational gains justified it. The outcomes were mixed, but instructive. Tactically, Patton's advances succeeded. American forces captured key terrain quickly, improved their confidence, and demonstrated an ability to operate independently at scale. These successes reinforced Patton's belief that aggressive action was vindicated by results. They also strengthened his reputation as a commander, capable of restoring momentum after earlier setbacks. At the same time, these actions intensified concerns among senior Allied leaders. Patton's willingness to interpret orders expansively raised questions about command discipline at the strategic level. If every commander acted on perceived opportunity without regard for coordination, coalition cohesion would suffer. Patton's behavior thus forced higher command to confront the limits of tolerated autonomy. Institutionally, the response was cautious. Patton was not reprimanded for his advances, but neither was his approach fully endorsed. His latitude remained situational, expanding when results were favorable and contracting when political or coalition considerations took precedence. This conditional acceptance would become a recurring pattern in his career. The Sicilian experience also affected Patton's self-perception. Success reinforced his conviction that higher headquarters underestimated the value of speed and overestimated the risks of independent action. This reinforced a feedback loop in which positive outcomes validated his methods, while institutional hesitation was interpreted as excessive caution. For analysts, Sicily serves as a case study in the consequences of expanding command authority in fluid operations. Patton's decisions demonstrate how initiative can accelerate success, but also how it constrain institutional structures designed to manage complexity and coalition relationships. His actions did not violate orders explicitly, but they tested the assumptions underlying them. This episode underscores a broader question that frames Patton's operational legacy. To what extent should commanders be encouraged to reinterpret authority in pursuit of opportunity? And where should institutional limits be enforced to preserve coherence? Sicily did not resolve this question. Instead, it revealed that Patton's effectiveness depended not only on battlefield conditions, but on the willingness of the institution to absorb the friction his methods generated. George S. Patton's career reached a critical inflection point during the Sicilian campaign, with the incidents involving soldiers suffering from what was then commonly described as battle fatigue. These events did not occur in isolation, nor were they accidental deviations from his command philosophy. They exposed the point at which Patton's internal logic collided directly with evolving institutional norms and political realities. Patton viewed combat effectiveness as inseparable from morale, and morale as inseparable from aggression. In his framework, psychological collapse under fire represented not merely an individual failure, but a threat to collective performance. He believed that visible tolerance of such collapse could spread hesitation throughout a unit, undermining cohesion at moments when decisiveness was required. This belief shaped his response when confronted with soldiers who had been removed from the front for psychological reasons.
At the time, the U.S. Army's understanding of combat stress was incomplete and unevenly applied. Medical doctrine regarding psychological casualties was still developing, and command attitudes varied widely. Some commanders accepted combat fatigue as an unavoidable consequence of prolonged exposure. Others, including Patton, interpreted it as a problem of discipline and leadership rather than medicine. Patton's actions reflected this latter view. He treated the incidents as disciplinary matters, emphasizing personal responsibility and the expectation of continued performance. From his perspective, firmness would restore confidence and deter further breakdowns. In his own reasoning, the long-term effectiveness of the force outweighed the immediate welfare of the individual. Institutional reaction to these actions was swift and revealing. Senior leadership did not primarily evaluate the incidents in terms of Patton's intent or operational rationale. Instead, they assessed their broader implications: public perception, civil-military norms, and the Army's responsibility toward its soldiers. As reports reached higher headquarters, it became clear that Patton's behavior was incompatible with emerging expectations of command conduct. The response balanced competing priorities. Patton was not removed permanently from service, reflecting recognition of his operational value. However, he was removed from frontline command and subjected to formal reprimand. This outcome illustrates the conditional nature of institutional tolerance. Effectiveness on the battlefield did not grant immunity from accountability when actions violated accepted norms. The slapping incidents also marked a shift in how Patton was managed by higher command. His autonomy was more closely monitored, and his role was recalibrated to reduce political and institutional risk.
While he would later return to operational command, the episode demonstrated that there were limits to how far his methods could be accommodated. Analytically, these incidents highlight the boundary between coercive discipline and institutional responsibility. Patton's approach assumed that fear and pressure could substitute for psychological support in maintaining combat effectiveness. The Army's response suggests a recognition that such substitution had limits, particularly in a mass citizen army operating under democratic oversight. The episode also complicates assessments of Patton's effectiveness. His disciplinary philosophy may have produced short-term compliance, but it proved incompatible with the Army's longer-term evolution. As medical understanding and societal expectations shifted, Patton's methods appeared increasingly anachronistic, regardless of their internal logic. Ultimately, the slapping incidents reveal the core tension of Patton's command style. His methods were designed to maximize immediate operational performance, often by compressing decision-making and tolerance for weakness. The institution, however, was required to balance performance with legitimacy, sustainability, and public trust. Where these priorities diverged, Patton's approach encountered firm limits. This confrontation between individual command philosophy and institutional constraint did not end Patton's career, but it reshaped it. It demonstrated that even highly effective commanders operate within boundaries defined not only by battlefield necessity, but by the values and structures of the organizations they serve. George S. Patton's command of the U.S. Third Army in France provided the clearest, large-scale demonstration of his operational philosophy. Unlike earlier phases of the war, where his authority was limited by coalition structure or political sensitivity, the breakout from Normandy created conditions in which speed and initiative were explicitly encouraged.
Patton interpreted this not as a temporary opportunity, but as validation of his long-held beliefs about modern warfare. Following Operation Cobra, German forces in Western Europe were disorganized, their command structures strained, and their defensive lines fragmented. Higher Allied command sought rapid exploitation to prevent reconstitution. Within this context, Patton was granted latitude to advance aggressively. He responded by emphasizing continuous movement, decentralized execution, and rapid decision-making across extended fronts. Patton's approach treated operational risk as an unavoidable and manageable component of success. He believed that the primary danger lay not in overextension, but in delay. In his assessment, every pause increased the likelihood that German forces would stabilize their lines, establish defensive positions, and regain coherence. Movement itself was intended to substitute for security. This philosophy produced extraordinary results. The Third Army advanced faster than any comparable Allied formation during the campaign, covering vast distances in a short period. German units were repeatedly outflanked, cut off, or forced into withdrawal without decisive engagement. From an operational perspective, Patton achieved disruption rather than destruction, collapsing German planning cycles faster than they could be repaired. However, this success imposed severe strain on logistical systems. Fuel shortages became chronic, maintenance schedules were compressed, and supply lines extended beyond planned limits. Patton was acutely aware of these constraints, but chose to accept them. He viewed logistics not as a limiting factor to be respected, but as a problem to be solved through improvisation and priority. This approach placed immense pressure on support units and higher headquarters. Supply allocations had to be constantly adjusted to sustain forward momentum.
When fuel shortages forced temporary halts, Patton interpreted them as institutional failures rather than operational necessities. This reinforced his skepticism towards centralized control and his belief that bureaucracy lagged behind battlefield reality. The reliance on improvisation also increased vulnerability. Rapid advances exposed flanks, reduced artillery support, and increased dependence on favorable enemy behavior. Patton's operation succeeded in part because German forces lacked the capacity to exploit these vulnerabilities. Had the enemy been stronger or better organized, the same risks might have produced significantly different outcomes. Another dimension of risk involved command and control. Patton's emphasis on decentralized execution empowered subordinate commanders to act independently, exploiting local opportunities without awaiting detailed instructions. This increased tempo, but reduced predictability. Errors at lower levels could escalate quickly, and coordination between adjacent units required constant adjustment. Institutionally, Patton's performance placed higher command in a difficult position. His results aligned with strategic objectives, yet his methods challenged established planning assumptions. The Third Army's success did not resolve debates about risk management. Instead, it intensified them. Patton demonstrated what was possible when constraints were relaxed, but also highlighted the costs of sustaining such an approach. Analytically, The Third Army campaign illustrates the conditional effectiveness of Patton's philosophy. When enemy resistance was fragmented and Allied superiority overwhelming, aggressive risk acceptance generated decisive operational advantage. The same philosophy, applied under less favorable conditions, could have produced unacceptable losses or operational collapse. Patton's command in France thus represents both the apex of his effectiveness and the clearest expression of his limitations.
He excelled when speed could substitute for security and when institutional systems could absorb the strain his methods generated. The extent to which these conditions were exceptional rather than replicable remains central to assessing his legacy. George S. Patton's response to the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944 is often cited as evidence of exceptional operational foresight. From an analytical perspective, however, the episode is best understood not as an isolated act of brilliance, but as the convergence of preparation, institutional alignment, and opportunity. The rapid redeployment of the Third Army northward was impressive, but it was not improvised in isolation from broader command structures. In the weeks preceding the German offensive, Patton had anticipated the possibility of a counterattack. This anticipation was not unique to him. Allied intelligence and planning staffs recognized the vulnerability of extended supply lines and thinly held sectors. Patton's contribution lay in his insistence on maintaining operational flexibility. He directed his staff to prepare contingency plans that would allow for rapid reorientation of forces if required. When the German attack began, the situation confronted Allied command with a crisis of coordination and time. German forces achieved tactical surprise, exploited poor weather, and disrupted communications. Higher headquarters required rapid stabilization to prevent a broader operational collapse. Within this context, Patton's readiness to act decisively aligned with institutional necessity. The redeployment of the Third Army involved significant logistical and organizational challenges. Units had to pivot across constrained road networks in winter conditions while maintaining cohesion and supply. Patton's staff played a critical role in translating intent into executable movement orders.
The success of the maneuver depended as much on staff competence and prior planning as on Patton's personal decisiveness. Patton's role in this process was to accept risk rapidly and to compress decision-making timelines. He issued clear intent and delegated execution, allowing subordinate commanders to resolve local problems independently. This approach accelerated movement but increased exposure to friction and error. Patton judged that these risks were acceptable given the operational stakes. The outcome reinforced his confidence in speed and initiative. The Third Army's movement contributed materially to relieving pressure on besieged American forces and restoring Allied operational balance. From Patton's perspective, the episode validated his belief that preparation, combined with audacity, could overcome uncertainty. However, a narrower focus on Patton risks obscuring the institutional factors that enabled success. Intelligence reporting, logistical capacity, road control measures, and Allied air power all contributed once weather conditions improved. The redeployment was effective because multiple systems functioned in parallel, not because of individual action alone. This distinction is important analytically. Patton's command style was effective in the Ardennes because institutional constraints were temporarily relaxed in favor of speed. Higher command accepted elevated risk because the alternative was operational defeat. Patton's philosophy aligned with institutional necessity rather than overriding it. The episode also illustrates the limits of extrapolation. The Ardennes redeployment succeeded under exceptional circumstances, a clear threat, broad consensus on urgency, and sufficient resources to absorb risk. Applying the same approach under less urgent or less resourced conditions might not have produced comparable results.
In evaluating Patton's performance during the Ardennes crisis, the question is not whether he acted decisively, but why his decisiveness was effective in this instance. The answer lies in alignment. Patton's preference for rapid action matched the immediate needs of Allied command, allowing his methods to operate without institutional resistance. This alignment was temporary. Once the crisis passed, normal constraints reasserted themselves. The Ardennes thus serves as a case study in conditional effectiveness, demonstrating how Patton's command philosophy could produce exceptional results when institutional systems, operational necessity, and individual inclination converged. George S. Patton's wartime record resists simple classification. His decisions cannot be reduced to either brilliance or recklessness without losing analytical clarity. Instead, his effectiveness must be understood as conditional, shaped by context, institutional tolerance, enemy condition, and the degree to which his methods aligned with broader strategic requirements. Patton's command philosophy was built around a single organizing principle: tempo. He believed that speed disrupted enemy decision-making more effectively than attrition, and that initiative, once seized, had to be maintained at all costs. This belief was internally consistent and repeatedly demonstrated operational value, particularly in fluid environments where enemy forces were already disorganized. However, this same principle generated risk when applied without restraint. Patton's preference for rapid action often assumed favorable conditions, adequate logistics, weak enemy coordination, and institutional willingness to absorb friction. When these assumptions held, his methods produced decisive results. When they did not, his approach exposed vulnerabilities that could not be mitigated by confidence alone. Institutionally, Patton functioned as a high-variance asset.
Senior Allied leadership recognized his ability to generate momentum and exploit opportunity, but also understood that his methods were not universally applicable. As a result, his autonomy expanded during crises and contracted during periods requiring stability, diplomacy, or coalition management. This pattern reflects an implicit institutional judgment. Patton was most useful under specific conditions, not as a general model for command. The recurring controversies surrounding Patton, discipline, authority, public conduct, were not peripheral to his effectiveness. They were integral to it. His intolerance for hesitation and weakness enabled rapid action, but it also limited his ability to operate within evolving norms of command responsibility. As the US Army matured, expanded, and adapted to prolonged war, some of Patton's assumptions became increasingly misaligned with institutional priorities. From an operational perspective, Patton's successes were real and consequential. He accelerated campaigns, disrupted enemy planning, and restored initiative at critical moments. Yet, these successes depended on systems beyond his control: logistics, intelligence, air superiority, and the efforts of subordinate commanders and staffs. His leadership amplified these systems when aligned, but could not replace them when absent. The question of genius versus overconfidence, therefore, is insufficient. Patton was neither a singular visionary operating above institutional constraint, nor merely a reckless commander fortunate in circumstance. He represented a specific solution to specific operational problems. His methods were optimized for speed, disruption, and exploitation, not for endurance, coalition management, or institutional adaptation. The broader lesson of Patton's career lies in the relationship between individual command style and organizational context. Effective military leadership is not solely a function of personal traits or bold decisions. It emerges from alignment between doctrine, institutional tolerance, and battlefield conditions. Patton succeeded most when these elements converged and faltered when they diverged. In this sense, Patton's legacy is less a prescription than a case study. It demonstrates the power of aggressive initiative under favorable conditions and the dangers of extrapolating that success beyond its context. His career underscores that even the most effective commanders operate within limits. Limits defined not only by the enemy, but by the institutions they serve. Patton's wartime experience thus offers a nuanced conclusion. His command philosophy was neither universally correct nor fundamentally flawed. It was conditionally effective, producing exceptional results when circumstances allowed and generating friction when they did not. Understanding this conditionality is essential to any serious assessment of his role in the Second World War.